And we're also going to invite Mala, who I just saw sneaking out. So when she comes back, we'll ask her to also be part of the conversation. Mala, for those of you who were not part of this morning's workshop, is the founder of Bodhi in Baroda and knew Riten personally, and so we had invited her to be to lead a workshop on block printing this morning. Nonetheless, we'll wait for Mala, but in the meantime, may I ask Ushmita, Nancy and Mayank to come back on stage?
So a lot of questions have been raised, and one question that has been in my mind, which you ended your kind of talk with, and which Mayank also touches upon, is the politics of the practice and how the role of the government vis-a-vis that time and present days. How do you correlate these two different time spans? One where most of the government institutions, art practices, craft practices are government funded, and now the present scenario. So how do we look at these practices and reconcile a practice like Riten, especially where in the climate, in the post-independent period, he's happy to use texts from all religions and say that these can exist independently without taking into consideration the religious connotations. So your take on that?
So as I said during my presentation, because it was really nice because you brought up this whole point about his intentionality. So on the one hand, there's this artist intentionality, which is he's saying, no, what I'm doing has nothing to do with the religious import of the script. They could be archetypal images, right? Or they could be formal elements, as you've said. And of course, that's completely valid. But still, it is the artist's intentionality. So therefore, we need to push it further and also look at the larger context. So the artist's intentionality has to be seen against the larger context of nationalist culture, of pedagogy, also of personal culture. So, the community that he comes from, the choices that he's making in terms of his ethnicity. So on the one hand, what you're born with, and then on the other hand, what you actually become in terms of the choices that you make. So the reason why I brought this point up, especially with the tapestry behind Jaspir Sachdev's head, was because on the one hand, you have the ancient seal, like you showed Babur's seal, and then you showed the tapestry. On the other hand, you have Bhajo Radhe Govind, very clearly mentioned. Now that's a Vaishnav chant, So there is this constant interplay. What I want to say is, and this is something I've learned from writing over 2 decades on art, is nuance is very important. In the sense that sometimes what happens is that if we only go by the artist's intentionality, then we will only be repeating what his perspective is. But we have to look at the space between his or her intentions and the evidence in the artwork itself. And of course, see both those features within the larger cultural and political context. So I'm just saying that it's about strategies of reading. And if you have this kind of a larger complex reading, then what you will end up with is not an either-or perspective, but a more complex, tense, conflicting perspective, which some people might be uncomfortable with, but which I'm always happy with. Because I believe that, the best of artistic impulses always emerge from contradictions and conflict. They are never, ever, occupying only, a single ground or one ground over the other. And, I think, Mayank, you should.
Well, I think it's very evident that during this time, the state had a very important role to play, because if you look at, for instance, the kind of projects that NID was doing in its early years, they were all about projecting India internationally. It was about getting orders from the world, simultaneously articulating a vision for yourself. And government intention was hugely embedded into...
The state was the curator of culture.
In many ways. It was the commissioner, it was the curator, it was the employment generator, and it took almost 3 decades of this kind of constant investment by the state to then lay the ground for the private sector to emerge. So the role of the government and its positioning, I mean, for instance, we were talking about the festivals of India and Vishwakarma. Uh, it was conceived of in the late 70s because India had the worst reputation in the world at that time because of the emergency. So it has been recorded that Mrs. Pupul suggested to Mrs. Gandhi that we send these massive exhibitions to revive the idea of India around the world after the emergency was lifted. And, these exhibitions opened at the Royal College of Art in just Vishwakarma, the textiles under the Smithsonian program went to 22 cities in America. The president of France and the prime minister of India would open the festival of France from the Eiffel Tower. So I mean there would be dancers on the Seine. So I mean these were huge cultural diplomacy initiatives to reproject an idea of India, and the role and the state had a very important role to play.
So look at another I mean, I'm just sort of, because we're...
I mean, just to kind of draw a parallel, today you have instances of Made in India, which becomes a big international campaign and things like that. So it's not that the government has stopped. It has, it's very, very conscious. It's just that other ways of communicating what India is and what have also, those opportunities have amplified. So, but yeah, it continues to be important. Yeah.
Oh, I think both of you have covered largely the thing. Just to add that if Riten were to use calligraphy, which you are stressing so much about, it's interesting that the block that we saw at the exhibit, the Goddess's Feet and the Ramnami, it's like a leitmotif that has appeared over and over again in scripting, in writing, in block printing, and everywhere. And I think I'm not surprised that Riten was also inspired by that, and he took his own. It was his own take. It was not directly the. I think for a designer to take inspirations from all over is very natural. It's very hard to pinpoint which is that moment and how you got it. The fact that, like Nancy mentioned, that your personal upbringing and your growing up also matters, and God knows when it manifests itself. For instance, when you shared that block with me over email a few months ago, I was surprised because as a young bride, when I went to Vishnupur, I picked up a gamcha from there, the identical same gamcha. It was with me for years. And one day I said that why don't I do a whole Devi collection? And that became a part of my collection 45 years later. Right? And then these days when I'm looking at the old Indian blocks, again I found the same feat yesterday when I was meeting somebody. So it is something that it has that quality that inspires many people. Now what is that quality? It's hard to define, but there is a quality.
May I add also, I mean, what I was also adhering to earlier was actually, because we look at him as a post-independent India contemporary designer, artist, with all of these connotations, it, without diminishing his work, of course, we have to also realize in many ways, because I look at historical Indian material, I feel in many ways Riten was actually only reinforcing tradition. So I think that is something that I think is important to also understand that, there's in art, there's constant reinforcement of age-old ideas, you add something new. And so,
So if I can add, a couple of things here. One being, when you talk about, is the artist really divorced from the readings of what he uses? Even if it did not,
the artist, but we take the artist's
exactly.
intentionality as something that's sovereign, and we
Yeah.
needn't. I'm saying that the reading will always fall between all these.
Right.
That's
So I just want to add there that Riten also came from a Brahmo background, and having grown up in Shantiniketan, which also has that, one Brahma and no particular kind of, textual religion. So he kind of grows up in that milieu, And so he, I think, already has that ability to not to look beyond the inherent religiosity of the texts, and coming.
And there is a I mean, there is, to use a very, very generic term, because I can't think of anything, there is a rurality to the aesthetic. So the minute you bring that into, it's, this idea of using jute ropes to make a couch. And so you have this kind of, and I believe, because I've also looked at archives of people like Shona Ray and all that at this time, Ritu Kumar was telling me that when she did the block printing on cotton and saris, nobody bought it. The minute she put it on chiffon. So somewhere chiffon was a new age material, but it was fashionable, but you still liked the aesthetic. So I think it was a time that, after extreme westernization, people were, and there was a rural, you see that in mud architecture, so.
And also, that's why I kind of focused on Shantiniketan being such an important aspect, because that is the beginning. And Tagore and Nandalal had explored that, going back to the roots, going to the, the Tagores were famous for designing their own clothes. They were very cosmopolitan, but at the same time, they were also researching the indigenous, the Bengal rural crafts, and bringing forth, things that had been lost due to the colonial rules. So
one of the things, like for instance, Mary Meko was hugely inspired by Japan.
Yeah.
So, the thing is that we are looking at it as Western modernism and a print company from the West, because today Scandinavia has become associated with a certain kind of minimalism. But, today we know more how much that Western modernism was actually inspired by the East.
Exactly. So the transcultural aspect also is very... In fact, you brought that up very beautifully, Ushmita. I mean, without framing it necessarily in that way, but the examples you gave were very beautiful, which is about the bamboos, the print which actually is inspired by bamboos, Benu Bono. So Benu Bono, and then you talked about how that was a design that he made for Marimekko. But then he makes something which is more Indian and then gives it a title which talks about East Europe. So these intersecting transcultural narratives are what actually interests me. Again, it's not about East-West. Exactly. And also even in the case of Nehruvian modernity, we must remember that it wasn't just, although of course there is this cliche, and there is a lot of truth to the cliche about the temples of India and an industrial modernity. It was always a two-track program. It was always, on the one hand, about industrial development, definitely, but on the other hand, it was also a civilizational perspective. So don't forget that. There's a whole line that actually continues from, Kumaraswamy, Havel, Nehru, and then again intersecting with Gandhi. So it's very complex. So it's not a simple thing of, industrial development will bring in westernization versus then, what are the artists going to do? What position will they take? Are they going to suppress their religious imagination? Will they only look at it as sacred versus religious? So, but what I'm saying is that both these perspectives existed. The civilizational.
I'll give you an illustration of what you're saying. When we've looked into this material where when they were doing space research, ISRO. And with the help of the USSR, there was huge amount of space research that was being used for agriculture and other kinds of purposes. And designers and artists would be involved. So you had these very interesting convergences without looking at them from those perspectives.
Even the festival, sorry, I know this is really exciting. We all want to talk, which is very rare. Normally we're just sitting solemnly. Just one small point just to add to what all of us were saying is that, again, the festivals of India that you brought up, Mayank. So on the one hand, of course, post-emergency, and you want to create a different kind of more liberal picture of India. But don't forget, that's also the same time when Rajiv Gandhi is trying to initiate, a new digital age. It's the beginning of computers.
Can you imagine what she showed, those Dashrath Patel? There would be, 12 channel videos in stadiums and auditorium and...
Yeah, so the Dashrath Patel was, of course, Montreal Fair. That was, 67.
But he did the same for festivals
but then later,
of India.
No, you're right. So then that also for Moscow and for Paris. But I'm saying in the festivals of India, since we brought that up, so again, on the one hand,
they were
there's
like
an
rock
exotic...
concerts today,
so
using technology.
Exactly.
They were,
so the light installation was for Paris. And then in Moscow, again, he was trying to find a different way in which he could actually, make a more democratic public space in, this was, again, late 80s, or it was in the 80s, so it was just before the fall of the Berlin Wall and stuff like that. So, again, questions of authoritarianism, democracy. It's very, very complicated. So, just to say that there are no binaries,
Yeah.
and there are no right or wrong answers. Everything is always, everything lies in the interstices. And if you look at it in that way, then it will also be truer to the way we live our lives, which is always full of contradictions, full of flaws,
So just pulling on two
Yeah.
threads, you mentioned the Nehruvian policies that were based on Anand Kumar Swamy, Havel, and then Gandhi, and you mentioned about Marimekko and the influence of Japan. So interestingly, in what you mentioned, Tagore is also a huge part of that. And when Tagore started his Shantiniketan experiment and Sriniketan, he invited designers, carpenters from Japan. He invited designers, especially weavers from Sweden, and a Sloyd system of design making was introduced. And so there's this already this, like you mentioned this, that the early modernism, if we can find where it can be located, so the early modernism may even have stretch back into a
it's
more deeper
absolutely,
past,
yeah. So,
which is not usually talked about.
Exactly, and as we all look back to what Shiv Kumar says, which is contextual modernism, he looks at the Shantiniketan experiment as if a form of contextual modernism, and of course this was also history which was suppressed, post-independence. And I remember the JJ School of Art artists, Tayyab Mehta and others, when they were much older, they told us about how they had misunderstood, they had actually, they had misunderstood, that Shantiniketan school is not the Bengal School of Art, because they just thought they were trying to conflate the two, and they hadn't understood the important achievements. It's only when you have people like Shiv Kumar, creating this whole pedagogy, writing these books, that's when again Shantiniketan comes back into circulation. But I just want to bring in one small thing, which is also very interesting when you showed us the wood blocks for the Palazzo della Civiltà. I hope I'm pronouncing Civitella. So now I find this very interesting. That of course the blocks play with this notion of negative and positive space. Now and he was in Rome at that time because he was traveling, he was studying, he went to Italy to study painting, etc. But so he takes a photograph of this monument. It's a monument of fascist architecture, right? So it has very clean lines. It's meant to basically endorse the sovereign power of the state, and the citizen is merely a speck. The citizen is supposed to be overawed by the state and by the authoritarian rule of the state. And then when I look at this, he's borrowing something from fascist architecture. I'm absolutely sure that he knew what he was borrowing from. He knew the politics of it, of course. And yet, when you look at the print, that manifests from that wood block and from that particular source, you could also see that perhaps he felt closer to it, not because it was fascist architecture, but because it could have reminded him of Abbasid architecture, the archways. So again, this is speculation, but what I'm again bringing in a way, following what you said during your presentation, which is again these transcultural intersections.
So are you saying that it was it may have been something that was familiar?
Exactly, something that was familiar. So somebody who's reading it from the outside, let's say maybe a European or an American, they might just say, "Oh God, why is he actually emulating a motif of fascist architecture?" So they might completely misunderstand that, or they might just think that, "Oh, this is an ignorant Indian designer who didn't know that he's emulating." A fascist motif. But I'm complicating this further. I'm saying, again, what we were talking about with Mala, the personal culture of the artist also. What, on the one hand, you have these, references from pedagogy, from what you see, which comes to you from outside. But on the other hand, you also have your own personal culture. So, I was just thinking, this beautiful wood block with its arches and negative spaces. And then, again, it's things that you might have seen in Mamluk or Abbasid architecture, these archways. So again, I'm complicating the reading, of how we can look at Mojumdar's
In
work.
today's time, it could be interpreted as Mughal design.
Exactly.
Because Mughal patterning is so in textiles these days that if you were to show it to a printer in Jaipur, arey ye to Mughal design hai.
Exactly.
That is how they will interpret, because they would not have gone through this entire gamut of discourse.
So I'm just saying something foreign, something familiar, and it's
Yes.
between
That
those
in between
two
space is what is
exactly-
very interesting.
exactly
Yes.
what creates,
Yes. 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 Yes.
Could we open it out to the audience as well?
Yeah, please.
Do we have a mic for?
Thanks. It was lovely to listen to all three because there were such different perspectives. There's just many things. I don't know if I'm going to make sense. But to take off from what Mayank laid the ground for, I think in textile particularly, the state-backed, decades intervention cannot be ignored. And I think that because it doesn't happen so much in other art forms, like, say, visual arts, which has come up organically and on its own through private galleries. And therefore, Riten is singular, even though we should read him, as you say, in everything, and we do. I don't think anyone sees art in that kind of form as a binary. But he's singular because he's the only person from that period in that time working like an artist in textile, but he's very interesting because he's the only person who's engaging with mass production. And I think that is what, that is something that is inescapable in all three presentations, and your readings from it, is that why are we discussing him today? Because, and going back to him. And as an artist, what comes out with Riten is that because, I don't know whether, it's Shantiniketan, his aesthetic as being Brahmo, being, distilling something to the essence, and then going to the West and coming back with this minimalism. And he's able to distill the form right down into a particular form. And that form, whether it's Benu Bono or whether it's the arches in the block print, it becomes very kind of translational across cultures. So it's an Indian aesthetic, yes, taking us back to the root, but it's easily readable for a Western aesthetic as well. And why I see a very kind of everlasting thing in his design, which you showed in the block print that he developed in the 60s, now again in 2013 coming back and being reused by Marimekko. So and growing up in the 70s and 80s, again, to come back to that whole political time when we didn't have access to fabric from abroad or this thing, we all grew up with looking for this, and yet there was this kind of modernization. We were, the post-60s generation. It was the pop culture. You were looking at graphics when you saw things coming up in magazines, and it was not just the Indian government engaged in soft culture, it was very much even the American government, and we grew up on Sputnik and on Span, on things that came down through us to small things. And these kind of very graphic images were what caught our eye. And then we used to have Gurjari, I remember, the block print, like, we didn't have, everyone made their own clothes. So you went and you looked, and so we grew up with this culture of block prints and things. And I wonder now that even we still don't have another Riten Mozumdar, say, after all these decades. And that's why he's singular. He's very singular in what he did. You have production houses, you have designers now catering. It was very, Riten's designs were very much part of the middle class, whether it was in the cushion covers you see in the film that you spotted, or whether you see it in Fab India. These were middle class stores of, a handloom house and cottage industries. And you just don't have that anymore. You have a Ritu Kumar, you have, say, okay, Anita Dongre, who does it in many layers, and you have a Ritu Kumar, but those government state-sponsored stores have disappeared. You just have Khadi, which is like almost dying out now. So when you talked about whether, I think it's really you raised several important points, Mayank, about, where are those fiber artists and how do we place them? And that is something that is just not in written history. You don't read about it, nothing. And I think a lot of, work can be done in that field to see why somebody like Riten Mozumdar, happened then, the Weaver Centers, which allow the space for so much experimentation, and it was state-backed. And it's a very different state backing now if you say made in India. It's a slogan with nothing, no infrastructure to back that.
I would like to comment on this. Is it okay? Or,
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. I think you have raised a very pertinent question. I can start by saying that Riten was very comfortable in the spaces that you spoke. I wouldn't say mass production, but limited edition production. Riten was never into hundreds and thousands. Neither was Fab India. Fab India now is into numbers, but in those days, it was small numbers. Because even the market was a niche market. The market was not a fast market. If I had 4 Target cushion covers, I was happy for a few Diwalis, however wealthy I may have been. But it was something that you bought and you cherished it for many, many years. That's how I look at it. I'm talking of probably the same time when you grew up, and I'm talking of the late 70s, early 80s. Riten also was what he was. What made him what he was is because his dexterity with several mediums. Painting, printing, wood carving, also sculpting, ability to do these large murals and mobiles, etc. And I can speak for myself, my husband, and us early designers, is in those days when work came to us, you never said, oh, this is not my area, I will get another specialist. We took what came to us. So in spite of the fact that my husband may have studied product design at NID, but if someone came and said that, why didn't you design a study table and a chair for my child who is, growing up and he needs to do homework at home, and he would very easily do it, applying the same thinking that NID taught us in terms of ergonomics and use of material, what is the kind of space he has, what does he need to keep, etc. So Riten also had the same I think a childlike innocence to experiment and explore materials, which is why his work, you use the word everlasting, which I loved. It kind of endears you even today. I hope I am able to make sense to what you are saying. And so whether it is calligraphy, whether it is the hexagonal jali from Saharanpur, everything is where Riten did with certain understanding of the material, and I don't think he much cared. I would like to believe, whatever little that I have met him, he didn't really care whether market would like it. He did it because he believed in it. And I think that is what, as designers, is lacking now. Today, we are fairly brief driven. What is it that you want? Instead of my saying, I don't have the prerogative anymore to say, why don't you try this? I don't have that ability to say this to client unless I'm doing something for my own production. It's a client who, and therefore we have become fairly market driven. I think what set Riten apart was that he was not driven by market. He did what he did, and I think times were wonderful. Women and men in Delhi and other places were very receptive to exploring and understanding his genre. It may have been a niche market. Also, I think if you had a Riten cushion cover or a calligraphy bed cover, it's like it kind of endorsed that you had good taste. It meant that, oh, you were a modern person, you were an English-speaking person, and therefore, bed covers, in fact, they just didn't leave the bedrooms open. All of that came into the living room. Yeah. And do you see the Target cushion cover? I just went to Delhi and I got them. That was the kind of, and I love that spirit of the Indian appreciation, of Indian people's appreciation of something which was solely ours. I don't know if I'm... solely ours as in solely Riten's, and it became everybody's.
Mala, since you have the microphone, can you also just speak to the idea of Riten as an educator, because
Okay.
you also he did teach you at NID.
Yeah. Um, I think, as a teacher, he was very benign. He was very gentle. He came to NID on invitation of Helena. He and John Bissell, both of them came to do a workshop with us, and that was across all batches. So I think for John and Riten, it was more a holiday, and let's engage with these young students from NID. Let's see what they would do, etc. So it was really brilliant. He was not very communicative in a large group, but if you went to him and sat on a one-on-one, he was absolutely brilliant. I mean, he was so patient, and when they left after a week, he said to us that whenever you people come to Delhi, do look us up. We would love to stay in touch with you. And I think we at NID thought that everybody liked us so much that we had to go and meet them, you know. So we did. I often went and met Riten, and I hung out with him at Green Park at Mini Boga's store, and so interested. What is it that you're? I don't think they were at all trying to preach us. They were at all trying to say that, oh, you youngsters have a lot to do. We were just having. They taught us how to have black coffee and green tea and stuff like that, where we were used to having lari chai and all of that. So that was, I mean, you know, they gave a certain refined taste like that, but there was no telling us. I think it was just by being with them and what they were doing is how I think we enriched ourselves and our design sensibility, is how I can say.
Are there more questions?
Hey, so Ushmita, you mentioned in the beginning of your talk there was an exhibition that he did with his wife and somebody else? No, who was it?
His wife, Leela Mukherjee, and Riten.
I can't hear you, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
So yeah, the exhibition that you're talking about, if I'm not mistaken, is the one where his teacher Binod Bihari Mukherjee, his teacher's wife Leela Mukherjee, who are Mrilanini Mukherjee's parents, and Riten was part of.
All right, thanks so much.
So thank you. If there are no more questions, then I think we'll.
I think I'll just
Yes,
just last.
please.
I wanted to respond earlier, Deepika, to what you had said. That just to reinforce what she was saying, we had mass production also. So you had mills that were producing so much that they took fashion shows, at a time that you didn't have retail. So Calico Museum had this geodesic dome built by built by Buckminster Fuller, and they would take it to 20 cities as fashion shows to sell their product. And some of these mills would go, and it was, models would be there would be stampedes because so many people would come, and it was also a way of selling. So you had mass production in that sense, which was,
Yeah.
so all of this happens, and so we have to look at Riten's, that in that sense his work was fairly limited to what today you would call niche, boutique, this thing.
Limited edition.
If I
But
can
So
add
I'm
one
sorry,
thing,
I didn't say that we didn't have mass production. Riten's work was not mass produced in that sense.
so
That's
if
what I
I
meant.
can just add a bit here.
you believe it was copied and
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
all of Meerut.
Did he have any solo show as a textile artist? Like you would say something like Monica would have.
so he had solos of his namdas. He had those solos in the Contemporary Crafts Museum and also the Danish Museum. He had shows of his namdas, daris, and other textiles all over India, especially at Jahangir and also at the Ford Foundation in Delhi and other places.
And in which decade would this
these are all between the 60s and the 80s. Some are, I have been able to date, some not so much, but looking at the images, that's the conjecture. But because by the late 80s, he's already moving back to Shantiniketan, so I would, put them between the 60s and the 70s mostly. So just
I'm told that he also had one very special exhibition. I'm sorry. He had this very special exhibition at the JJ School of Arts in the hall there. I forgot to mention this to
Oh,
you.
really?
Yes.
When?
The sari that I was wearing, printed by Hussaini Bhai, when I asked him as to where did you meet Ritenda in Bombay, he said at the JJ School, in the hall there. It's because the arches that you show me in the photograph, maybe they are from the JJ School.
That's
That is one thing that we need to
That's
get.
interesting.
Yeah.
But if I can just come back to that mass production idea, so it's interesting because Riten is working on both the counts. He's working like an artist, doing either limited edition or one-off objects. But then he's also designing for even companies. He designed towels for DCM. So he's also part of that as a consultant to many of the companies who are doing mass production work. So again, like Mayank and Mala both say that he was juggling a lot of roles. On one hand, he called himself a sculptor and an artist, designer, and then he was also advisor to so many other firms and companies.
But Deepika, one of this thing about state-supported taste making. This was state-supported taste making was also that, and one thing that we often don't talk about is the classicism in such design, because it was very upper caste, English-speaking, Western-educated Indians who were recipients or consumers of such product. And the reason craft gets elevated is because at a time, you have an anti-colonial sentiment in the country, so you want to reject British aesthetics and things like that. But what is interesting is that the counterpoint to that is craft, and that emerges because you had interior designers like Shona, Ray, Riten. So it's something actually that Shukla Sawant brought up in a discussion earlier, who teaches at the JNU School of Art and Aesthetics, that while we may view all of these occurrences of how handcraft becomes really important, we have to also view that the reason it got legitimacy was because it was being enabled, produced, worn and consumed by a class of Indians who had actually rejected Western clothing in that sense and taken to this. So there was a certain taste making, in all of this, which was coming very much from this kind of it was an aspirational aesthetic, like she said. So we have to discuss some of these things about taste making in light of also what you were saying, because this taste making was, all government, 60% during a certain period, 60% of government offices had to have handlooms. So suddenly, they had raw silk in all the sofas because it was, so these kinds of, it was about a certain kind of taste making. Yes. Yeah. So when you went into a hotel, you were actually participating in a kind of taste making because you were learning how to be in a certain kind of environment, and so
Yeah, it's like Pupul Band wearing a handloom sari.
Or Riten wearing a short
waves.
kurta. He started the trend for wearing the short kurtas.
Okay, I'm gonna intervene. Okay, Manisha, this will be the last question.
I just wanted to ask Ushmita, how have you been putting together Riten's archives? Because how have you been collecting material? Is there material out there? Because one of the things we do find, especially with a lot of textile practitioners, even today, there's no sense of documentation, research, even photographs are so hard to come by, even, from some place like Dastakar. Today, you ask for a photograph and it's practically impossible to get any sense of the early photography. So how successful have you been in putting Riten's archive together just for even this exhibition? Is there material out there?
So it's not been easy. It's been yeah. So one thing that has helped me is, I think, who Riten was as a person. So all his friends or acquaintances or people who worked with him who are still around, the moment you tell them that I'm researching on Riten, they open their hearts and doors, and they've let me photograph whatever materials they have. Then there have been interviews that I've been conducting with personalities who knew him, and then there's photographs left over with the friends and family. So it's been a hard way forward, collecting material from many different sources. So the exhibition that you see is again material collected from quite a few lenders and sources.
And actually, there's a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure. I mean, as I
Riten
go
himself
forward,
didn't keep his drawings.
He did actually.
yeah, some
good
He's an
at
yeah,
artist.
some of the things are from what he left with his heirs. Yes.
There's so much more to be said, and we do hope that in the future there will be further exhibitions also of Riten's where we'll be able to show more material than was possible at our gallery in Bombay because of space constraints. So I think it's watch this space, and also we hope to have many more opportunities for discussion around his practice. But for today, please join me in thanking our speakers and Mala for the workshop. And can I just invite Romy to give our speakers, Mala and Pradeep, if you don't mind, just come to the stage for 1 second. Pradeep, who Mala and Pradeep put the workshop together this morning. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the audience for coming as well. Thank you. You have to guess. You each have to guess which is for you. Thank you. Thanks for everyone for coming.